Montana Territory, 1884. The wind whipped hard over the Bitterroot Range, but the train whistle cut through louder, shrill, and sharp as it pulled into the wooden station at Garnet Creek. Frances Whitley stepped down from the last car of the Northern Pacific, her boots hitting the packed dirt with a soft thud. She held her coat shut with one hand and her travel bag in the other. The platform was nearly empty, save for a boy dragging crates and a woman shouting names near a wagon. Frances inhaled deeply. The air smelled like pine and coal dust. She stood a full head taller than the porter who had helped her off the train and most of the men in sight. Her hat did little to hide it. She scanned the platform for a man in a brown hat, short, with a red kerchief. The description from the letter. Her husband-to-be. He had written in plain words, "I am not a tall man, but I work hard. I have a house, and I am kind. If you are willing, I will take good care of you." Frances had nothing left in Illinois. Her father died 2 winters ago, her mother the spring before that. The boarding house she worked in went under. She had answered the ad out of necessity, but also, maybe hope. A man stepped forward now, hat in hand. He was short several inches below her shoulder, if she guessed right, with dark blonde hair and eyes the color of creek water. He looked up at her and smiled wide, nervous. "You must be Miss Whitley?" he asked. She nodded. "Frances. I'm Josiah Harlan. Folks call me Joe." He looked at her like he could not believe she was real. She'd tied her dark hair back, wore a simple wool skirt and a blouse, but there was no hiding her height. Her eyes were soft brown and her mouth unsure. "You're taller than I expected," he said. Frances tensed. "If that's a problem," Joe shook his head, grinning. "No, ma'am. I like it. Now I don't have to reach." Frances blinked, caught off guard. She laughed before she could stop herself. "That's the first time anyone said that." He offered his arm. "Let me take your bag. Wagon's this way." She handed it over, and they walked toward the wagon hitched to a paint mare. Joe helped her up, then climbed in beside her. As they rolled out of town, he pointed to the tree line. "Our place is about 5 miles out. Cabin backs up to the hills. There's a creek, and wildflowers come up in spring." Frances looked out, watching the pines blur past. "It sounds peaceful." Joe glanced over at her. "It is. Gets quiet sometimes, but I like it that way." The trail wound up through rocky brush and pine forest. When the cabin came into view, Frances felt her heart settle. It was small, but clean squared logs, a sloped roof, smoke curling from the chimney. A pen sat off to the side where 2 goats milled around. A coop with hens. A shed. Everything looked cared for. Joe helped her down. "I built it 3 years ago. Added the second room last fall. Figured if you came, you'd want your own space till we figure things out." She looked at him, and something warm tugged in her chest. "Thank you." He led her inside, showing her the kitchen corner, the wash basin, the stove. The second room had a small bed, a trunk, and a window that faced the trees. Joe stood in the doorway. "If you ever want to go back, I'll pay your fare." "I mean that." Frances turned to him. "I came here to stay." He nodded, his jaw tight. "Then you are welcome for as long as you want." They fell into a rhythm over the next week. Frances cooked and mended. Joe chopped wood and worked the shed where he carved furniture for town. They ate together near the fire, sometimes speaking, sometimes not. It was easy, comfortable, but quiet. One afternoon, Joe returned from town with a letter in hand. Frances looked up from feeding the hens. He looked shaken. "It's from my cousin. He passed through Fort Shaw. Said there's a woman and 2 kids stranded there. Husband died coming west. She's got no way to get further." Frances wiped her hands. "What's her name?" "Claire. Her boys are 6 and 4. My cousin says folks are ignoring them." Frances stepped closer. "We cannot leave her there." Joe nodded. "I was thinking. I could ride out. Bring them here." She looked at him, surprised. "You would do that?" He met her eyes. "We have room. And no one should be left like that." He left the next morning, before sun up, promising to be back in 3 days. Frances kept the fire going, cooked stew, and checked the spare room. She had never had children around before. But something about it stirred her. On the 3rd evening, hooves sounded on the trail. Frances stepped out and saw Joe's horse pulling a small cart. A woman sat beside him, wrapped in a blanket. 2 small boys huddled in the back. Frances helped them down. Claire was thin, her eyes sunken with worry. The boys were silent. Joe introduced Frances gently. "She's my wife." That word hit something deep inside her chest. Not because he said it to prove anything, but because it already felt true. Claire looked at Francis with wet eyes. Thank you. Francis touched her arm. You are safe now. That night, they all ate together. The boys clung to each other, but ate like they had not seen stew in a month. Francis helped Claire settle in the spare room with the children. When she came back to the kitchen, Joe was still sitting by the fire, staring at the flames. She sat beside him. You did a good thing, she said. He looked at her and gave a small nod. I just could not stand thinking of them out there alone. Francis touched his hand. He looked down at where their fingers brushed, then up at her. You are not like anyone I have ever met, she whispered. Joe's throat worked. You are the bravest woman I have ever known. They sat quiet after that, side by side, hands resting together. And that night, for the first time since arriving, Francis did not close her bedroom door. The wind shifted by late March, warmer now, slipping through the cabin's chinks and stirring the scent of thawing earth. Snow still clung in the shadows of the pines beyond the clearing, but the path to the chicken coop had turned to soft mud, and the hens scratched greedily. Claire took to mending clothes at the table while her boys, Daniel and Eli, helped Joe cut kindling. Francis kept to the stove that morning, her sleeves rolled, hair pinned back tighter than usual. The cabin had grown fuller, but not tense, just layered. Voices overlapped now, laughter sometimes, and quiet crying once or twice when Claire thought no one heard. Joe came in with Eli perched on his hip, boots caked with mud. He says the goats need names. Francis turned from the kettle. What did you have in mind? Eli shrugged. One's got a floppy ear. Joe set him down. That's not much of a name. Eli lit up. Floppy then. Joe gave Francis a look that said he wouldn't argue with that. After supper, Claire took the boys into the room they shared. Francis lingered at the table, folding the dishcloth slow, deliberate. Joe set the last plate in the drying rack and leaned on the counter, arms crossed. You don't say much about where you came from, he said. She didn't look up right away. There's not much to miss. He waited. My father ran a smithy. I worked beside him after my mother passed. Folks didn't much like a woman hammering iron. I was too tall, too plain, too strange for most. She paused. After he died, I kept to myself. I didn't expect much. You should have. Francis met his eyes. Why did you really send that letter? Joe's gaze didn't shift. I was tired of empty rooms and silence. I wanted someone who'd stand beside me, not behind. Someone who'd see what I built and not ask me to be more than I am. Francis reached across the table and touched his wrist. You've never asked me to be less. I never will. The fire popped low behind them. His hand turned in hers, fingers wrapping around like he'd been waiting for permission. She didn't pull away. Later, when the house had gone quiet, Joe stepped outside to check the latch on the shed. Francis followed, arms wrapped in her shawl. She stood beside him under the stars, the sky wide and without end. You ever think about what comes next? She asked. He turned to her. Every morning. Did you imagine this? He shook his head slowly. No. I figured I'd die with a stove that didn't get hot enough and a roof that always leaked. She almost smiled. Your roof doesn't leak. He looked up. Not anymore. They stood in silence. Then Francis said, Claire's strong. She'll find her footing. She already is. I was afraid I wouldn't fit here, she said. Didn't think I could make a home somewhere so far from where I began. Joe looked at her, close now beneath the stars. You didn't find a home, Francis. You made one. She stepped closer. With you. His voice came low. Always with me. He didn't kiss her then. He didn't need to. They stood together until the cold crept through their sleeves, and then, without a word, they went inside. The ground thawed fully by early April. Francis stood barefoot behind the cabin, her hem hitched above her ankles, planting onion sets into the wet soil. Her hands worked steady and sure, dirt packed beneath her nails, the smell of warming loam rising with each press of her fingers. Nearby, Claire knelt beside her, sleeves rolled, silent in her concentration. The boys played at the creek's edge, stacking stones into a crooked tower. Joe had taken the wagon to Garnet Creek with a load of finished chairs and a carved cradle for the mercantile. He'd left before dawn, promising to be back before supper. Francis watched the tree line on and off, not out of worry, but out of habit. Claire sat back on her heels, brushing a strand of hair from her brow. You ever think you'd end up here? Frances shook her head. I didn't think I'd end up much of anywhere. Claire looked toward the boys. They ask about their fathers sometimes. I don't always know what to say. You say what you can, Frances said. That he tried. Claire nodded slowly. You and Joe. It's quiet between you two, but not empty. Frances pressed another bulb into the soil. There's no need for noise when you're steady. Claire smiled faintly. I hope I find that one day. You will, Frances said softly. You already know what matters. That evening, as dusk settled in lavender folds over the hills, they heard the wagon wheels crunch on the gravel. Frances rose from the porch step where she'd been shelling peas, her palms green and damp. She wiped them on her apron and walked to meet Joe before he'd swung down. He handed her a bundle wrapped in brown cloth. Found these at the trader's. Thought you might like 'em. Inside were lengths of calico blue, russet, and a pale green with tiny wheat flowers. Frances traced the fabric with her thumb. They reminded me of you, he said. She looked up at him, and something in her eyes shifted. I'll make a dress from the blue. Joe tilted his head. Why that one? Because it matches the sky when you come home. The next Sunday, they all walked to the small clapboard meeting hall that served as church once a month. The boys wore shirts Frances had mended, and Claire tied her hair with ribbon. Frances had finished the blue dress in 2 evenings, the hem hitting just above her boots. Joe looked at her longer than usual when she stepped from the cabin. Inside, they sat on split log benches, hymns rising soft and slow. Afterward, while the boys chased each other in the field behind, Joe stood with Frances beneath a cottonwood tree. I've been thinking, he said. She waited. I have land enough to register another section. If I build out the barn, I could keep a few horses. Maybe train them, sell them off in town. Frances brushed a leaf from his shoulder. And you'd need someone to help. He chuckled. That I would. She let her hand rest there. I've never trained a horse. Neither have I. But I reckon we could learn together. She looked at him, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the sun-browned skin beneath his collar. You always include me in your plans. He met her gaze. I don't make any without you in them. They stood there until the boys tugged them back toward the wagon, hands sticky with wild plum juice. On the ride home, Frances sat beside Joe, her hand resting lightly on his thigh. He didn't speak, just laid his palm over hers, warm and steady. That night, after the others had gone to sleep, Frances stepped into the kitchen where Joe sat finishing a ledger. The lantern cast soft shadows along the walls. She walked over and took the pencil from his hand, set it gently aside. I'd like to share a room, she said. His eyes searched hers. Are you certain? She nodded once. I'm ready. Joe stood slowly, the chair scraping back, and reached for her hand. He said nothing, but the look in his eyes was reverent, as though he'd been entrusted with something sacred. They walked down the short hallway together, her fingers wrapped firm around his. And for the first time, the door to the second room stayed open. By mid-May, the hills above the cabin were veined with lupin and yarrow, and the creek ran clearer, louder with meltwater. Frances stood on the ridge above the goat pen, a coil of rope slung over her shoulder, watching the weather gather in the west. The horizon had gone the color of iron. A storm would roll in before nightfall. Joe came up from the lower field, sleeves damp with sweat, his hat pushed back. He stopped beside her, eyes scanning the sky. We'll need to bring the chickens in early, he said. Wind'll be strong with it. Frances nodded. I'll see to the windows in Claire's room. He reached out and brushed a bit of hay from her shoulder. You've been watching that ridge all morning. There's something about the way the clouds move here, she said. They don't build the same as back east. They stretch long before they fall. Joe shifted beside her. You think about home often? She shook her head. Not since I stopped calling it that. They turned back toward the cabin, the air already thickening. Claire had the boys inside, pulling quilts from the trunk, her hair pinned up in a way she hadn't worn it before. Frances helped bar the shutters. Joe brought the goats under the lean-to and added another layer of straw. The storm hit just after sunset. Thunder rolled low and steady, not sharp, but deep, like something ancient moving underground. Rain hit the roof in steady sheets. Inside, the lamplight flickered, and the boys huddled on the floor with carved animals Joe had whittled for them earlier in the spring. Claire rocked gently in the corner, Daniel's head resting against her knee. She looked toward Frances. They've slept through worse, she said. But they always listen for the thunder anyway. Frances knelt with them, running her hand over Eli's hair. It's like the earth catching its breath. Joe came in from the barn soaked through, boots slick with mud. He hung his coat by the stove and looked at Frances. Wind caught the door once, but it's holding. She crossed the room, took a towel from the hook, and pressed it into his hands. Dry off before you catch cold. He didn't move right away, just looked at her with a softness that hadn't come easily in the first weeks. Then he took the towel and held her wrist for a moment longer than needed. When the storm passed, Claire took the boys to bed, her voice low as she sang them into sleep. Frances and Joe sat by the stove, a single lamp burning between them. She pulled her braid over her shoulder and unwound it slowly, fingers working through the dampness. I used to think quiet meant loneliness, she said, but I don't feel alone here. Joe leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You're not. You never will be again. She looked up at him, eyes shining from the fire's glow. I believe you. They sat in the hush that followed storms, the kind of silence that feels earned. Joe reached into his pocket and took out a small, folded pouch made of soft leather. He handed it to her without a word. She opened it gently. Inside was a silver brooch, shaped like a branch of aspen leaves. The detail was delicate, the edges smooth from handling. I traded for it last time I went into Garnet, he said. Thought it might suit you. Frances ran her thumb over the cool silver. It's beautiful. You remind me of those leaves, he said. Tall, quiet, but always moving with the light. She swallowed against the ache that rose in her throat. No one's ever given me something like this. Joe stood and held out his hand. She took it, setting the brooch aside. He pulled her gently to her feet, and they stood there, nothing between them but breath and the soft creak of the old wood beneath their boots. He reached up and touched her cheek. You're not too tall for me, Frances. Her voice was barely a whisper. You never made me feel I was. He leaned in slowly, with deep care, like a man who knew what it meant to be allowed to hold something rare. Their lips met in the hush of that cabin, the storm behind them, the fire warm at their backs. Later, as the wind died and the lantern burned low, they lay curled on the narrow bed, her head tucked beneath his chin, his arm wrapped around her waist. Outside, the air smelled clean, scrubbed by rain. He whispered into her hair, You're my home. And Frances, for the first time in all her years, believed it. The days stretched longer as June settled into the valley. Frances rose early now, before the sun had cleared the ridge, her feet bare on the plank floor, the soft hush of morning settling over the cabin like a shawl. She moved with purpose, but without rush. Eggs gathered, bread started, hands in flour before the boys stirred in the next room. Joe had begun expanding the barn. Each evening he came in with sawdust in his hair and the tired satisfaction of work well done. Frances patched his shirts without being asked, sewing by lamplight after the house quieted. Claire had taken to teaching the boys their letters at the table, using a slate board Joe had carved from pine. One afternoon, Frances stood outside the shed, watching Joe measure the beams for the new stall. He straightened, brushing his hands on his trousers. Thinking I'll finish the roof this week, he said, if the weather holds. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. And after that, he glanced toward her, then back at the frame. Been wondering if we might keep a mare. Not for selling. For us. Frances tilted her head. A horse just to ride? He nodded. You've never seen the high pasture. I'd like to show it to you. She stepped closer, her voice lower. You plan far ahead. Joe ran his thumb along the edge of a board. I didn't used to. But now I wake up thinking what else I can build. That night, once the boys were asleep and Claire had gone to bed, Frances stepped outside to find Joe sitting on the porch rail, the stars bright above the hills. She sat beside him, shoulders touching. I never asked you, she said. Why furniture? He looked over, thoughtful. Started with a stool. First winter I was here, the ground froze hard and I couldn't dig fence posts. I had scrap wood in time. Turned out I liked shaping something that would last. She rested her chin on her hand. You're good at lasting things. Joe's voice was quiet. People don't always stay. But a chair, a house, a life you build with your own hands that stays. Frances reached for his hand. I'm not going anywhere. He turned toward her, eyes steady. I know. The next morning, Claire found Frances in the garden, kneeling among the beans. She hesitated, then crouched beside her. I've been thinking of going into town once a week, Claire said. Taking and mending, maybe helping at the school. It isn't much, but it's something. Frances wiped her palms on her skirt. You sure you're ready? Claire nodded. It's time. I want the boys to see me doing something that makes a mark. Frances gave a small smile. You already are. They didn't speak more than that, but the next day, Joe hitched the wagon and drove Claire and the boys to town. Frances watched them go from the porch, her hand resting on the doorframe. When Joe returned, the seat beside him empty. He looked at her like he always had, like she was the first thing he saw. Later that week, Joe brought home a bay mare with a white star on her forehead. Frances slipped her hand along the horse's neck, the animal warm and calm beneath her touch. She's gentle, Joe said. Figured she'd suit you. Frances looked at him, the corners of her mouth lifting. Then you figured right. They rode out the next morning, just the two of them, winding up the trail beyond the cabin, where the trees thinned and the land opened wide. At the crest, the pasture stretched out below, green and gold, dotted with wildflowers. Frances reined in beside Joe, the wind lifting her hair loose from its braid. I didn't know anything could be this quiet, she said. Joe looked out over the land. First time I came here, I stood right where you are. Told myself if I ever had someone to share it with, I'd bring them here. She turned to him, eyes soft. You waited a long time. He reached for her hand. I'd wait again, if it meant finding you. They stood there, side by side, the horses shifting beneath them, the sun warm on their backs. When they rode down, the trail felt less like a path and more like a place they belonged. That evening, Frances brought out the brooch Joe had given her and pinned it to the collar of her dress. She waited until the supper plates were cleared and the oil lamp lit low. Then she took Joe's hand and led him to the front room. I want to marry you properly, she said. He looked at her, not startled but moved. I thought we already were. We are, she nodded. But I'd like to stand up and say it out loud. In front of the boys. Claire. Maybe the preacher from town. Joe's voice caught slightly. You sure? Frances smiled. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. They were married 2 weeks later in the clearing behind the cabin, under a makeshift arch of woven pine boughs and wildflowers. Claire adjusted the hem of Frances's dress, and the boys carried a basket of petals they scattered with solemn faces. The preacher came up from town, his wife bringing fresh biscuits to share after. Joe wore his best shirt, the collar stiff, hair combed back. Frances stood beside him, tall and unshaken, the blue dress now pressed and pinned with the silver brooch. She spoke her vows clearly, without trembling. I will walk beside you, she said. No matter the season, no matter the road. Joe took her hands, his voice low but sure. I will build every step of our life with you in it. Afterward, they danced under the open sky, Claire humming a tune while the boys clapped along. Frances laughed, the sound rich and full, and Joe spun her once, his hands steady at her waist. There was no fanfare, no music beyond voices and wind, but it was more than enough. That night, when the sky deepened to velvet and the lanterns burned low, Frances laid her head on Joe's chest and closed her eyes. This is home, she whispered. And Joe answered, always. Years passed with the slow rhythm of seasons. Claire began teaching in town full-time, her sons growing strong and sure under the wide Montana sky. Joe's furniture traveled farther than Garnet Creek, his name spoken with quiet respect in each place it landed. Frances grew a garden that fed them all, her hands steady through drought and flood. They never left the cabin. They never needed to. On quiet evenings, when the light bent long through the trees and the creek whispered just beyond the window, Joe would sit beside Frances on the porch. He'd rest his hand on hers, now worn from years of work, and she'd lean into him, the silence between them as full as any song. And always, always, they loved one another without question, without end.